long way since then. You know, the metaphysical stuff I'm into now, I'm learning more and more and more stuff. So she went and read it, and she cried most of the way through it. But she told me, she said, "Mom, this book has to be published." You said it's a bridge book, didn't you? That, will you tell them what you said? Okay. Okay, go ahead. Well, she said it was a bridge book because there are a lot of people out there now who don't know the basics. That's one thing. But also, it's to show how far you can come. She was thinking it needed to be required reading in my classes now to show what you can do and not even having a clue what you were doing and what you could accomplish with it. And it's like a time capsule, also, she said, because it is the 60s and the way things were in those days, the belief system, all of it. Well, anyway, she said it's got to come out. So then I took it and read it, and I said, well, you know, it is a good book, and there are people out there who were just beginning and just starting these things. So the only thing I had to do was write an introduction explaining why it was so long coming. And then we sent it to the printers. And we were hoping to have it here in time for this, but it'll be a few days before it gets out. Okay, Monday we'll be out of here by that time. Anyway, we do have order blanks on it, and some people say they want everything I've written anyway. And this is the beginning of how I started out on this long, long journey that's taken me 40 years to get to this point. So if anybody's interested, we do have the order blanks, and we'll fill them as soon as the book gets here. But it's 5 Lives Remembered. So then I won't have any excuses anymore then, but you know, I'm still writing more books. There's still more coming. Okay, but, well, anyway. But anyway, it shows nothing is ever easy. You know, if you start on a path, you better make sure that's what you want to do. That's why I didn't find my first publisher for 9 years. Took me 9 years to find the first publisher. I call that my testing time. They were testing me. Like, okay, you can back out if you want. You got a chance, you can back out. Once you're committed, there's no backing out. And that's what it was like until finally I said, okay, I'm going to do this. I want to do this. And the minute I made that commitment, everything began to happen. And I found my first publisher right after that. I just sat one night, I said, okay, it's yours. You do whatever you want to do with it. I'm tired of sending it out and having it come back and rejections. But the minute I made that commitment and said, I'm going to do this, then everything began happening. So there's no way out now. But the first books came out in 1989. The first ones to be published were the Nostradamus material. They weren't the first ones I wrote, but they were the first ones to come out. So I'm going to tell you about the Nostradamus material anyway, because by that time I had already written the Jesus books. I think I'd written Keepers of the Garden and Between Death and Life. And then I got involved in the Nostradamus material at the same time that I became a UFO investigator, because I've been doing that for 20 years, working on UFO cases and ETs. So now I'm into all of it. I ended up writing 4 books about the UFOs. But the Nostradamus material happened at the same time I was working on the beginning of the UFO investigations. Well, by this time, I don't think anything could surprise me. We had all these years of working on this. But the Nostradamus material was very strange. I didn't go looking for it. I don't think anybody could. But I had a woman, just wanted to go into some past lives. She didn't really know anything about metaphysics. I call her an ordinary woman because she had 10 children. One of them was deaf and mute, and she had never finished high school. She dropped out of high school to take care of this large family. She had 2 jobs. So it's not the kind of person you would think had time to sit down and say, well, let's think of a hoax to fool the world. And that's what I have been accused of. I've been accused of everything you can think of. But they say, oh, you're a really good fiction writer. I couldn't begin to make up these things I write about. But this was a woman who had no idea what was going on. I had a past life with her. She goes back to a past life where she was a student of Nostradamus in the 1500s in France. She didn't even know later who Nostradamus was. She couldn't even pronounce his name. I knew who he was, but I'd never studied the prophecies. Now they're saying I'm the world's foremost expert on the Nostradamus prophecies. But when I started out, I didn't know anything more than anybody in this room. But, you probably know who he is. Sometimes I get people who don't know who he is. He was the most famous psychic that ever lived, and he lived in the 1500s in France, and he wrote almost 1,000 quatrains. And the quatrains are 4-line poems, but that also they're 4-line puzzles in the case of Nostradamus. A prophecy or a puzzle, and he wrote them in the most amazing language. People have been studying them for over 400 years, trying to figure out what they mean. When I started lecturing on this, I had one man that told me he'd spent 4 years on one of the prophecies, trying to figure it out. Because Nostradamus used anagrams, he used symbolism, he used many other languages, he used made-up words. And so they're very difficult to understand, and there's almost 1,000 of them. And this is the first time all of them have ever been interpreted. There's books out there that tell you what the words mean and the cities and things, but they don't tell you what the prophecy means. But I didn't know any of this when I started out with this. So the woman goes back to where she is a student of Nostradamus in France, and I was thinking, well, maybe she could tell me something about this great man, and maybe it'd make an interesting chapter in a book of miscellaneous regressions down the road. That book of miscellaneous regressions turned into a 3-volume set. But she began telling me about Nostradamus, so she was a student. And at that time, I didn't know that he had students, but they were studying with him in secret, because at that time, they would have been killed. He would have been killed if he knew what he was predicting the future. He said he would have either been killed or he would have had his land taken away and put in prison. So it was a dangerous time to live. So he had students coming to his house, and they were pretending to be studying medicine with him, because Nostradamus was a very famous physician. He would have been remembered as a doctor if even people had forgot all about the prophecies. But he said he was teaching them medicine. Actually, he was teaching them metaphysics and teaching them to see the future the same way that he did. So that was what they were teaching. So this young man, the woman who was the student in the past life, was one that was studying with him. So as we were talking about him, that's when everything got very strange. Because all of a sudden, as she's talking to him, she said, "He wants to speak to you." I said, "What? What are you talking about?" "He wants to speak to you." And apparently he knew what his student was doing. And so, I didn't know what was going to happen. What she did, she put her hand up to keep me quiet, and she would listen to what he was saying. Then she would repeat to me what he was saying, like she was in the middle. So it's not really channeling. She was back and forth answering the questions. And she would repeat it back and forth. He's saying this, and he's telling you this. And he said he's been looking for a link to the future, because he could see that his prophecies were not being correctly interpreted, and the time is coming when they're going to come true. And he was very worried that we were not going to get the information in time. So he said, "I have an assignment for you." Yeah, I mean, I was in there, what? He said, I see there's a book in your time that has my prophecies in them. They've come down to your time. I want you to get that book, and I want you to read them to me one by one, and I will tell you what they mean, what the prophecy means, what time period it belongs to. And he said, I was supposed to write it and get it into our language of our time so the people could be warmed in time. And I was thinking, oh, gee, thanks. Because who would have thought something like that? Anyway, when the woman woke up, because when they're in this level, they don't remember anything. The woman woke up, and I told her what had just happened and what she was supposed to do. She was so frightened, she moved to Alaska. So you can't say, I started it. You can't say she started it. She didn't want any part of it. She was from Alaska, and I think she decided it was time to go home. She wanted to put as much distance between me and her as she could. So, but anyway, we had time for one more session. She did agree to that before she was going to leave. And I think it was just more to appease me than anything else. So we had it in her house, and they had been moving the furniture. There were packing boxes all over the place, and they were going to have a going-away dinner for her. She said, I got 1 hour, and that's all I can do. It's just to make me feel better. So we had the session again, and it happened again. He came through again, and he said, you must do this work. It is very, very important to your time. I said, I can't. She's moving away. He said, that doesn't matter. Now that we have made this connection, you will never lose me. I will come through anybody you work with. That's a big statement because I worked with a lot of people. And he said, he gave me the instructions on how to locate him and tests to perform so I would know it was actually him that I was speaking to each time. And then the woman moved away. And it's like, okay, now what do I do? So it was a couple of months. And during that time, I wrote the first 4 chapters of the first volume of Conversations with Nostradamus, not knowing if it was going anywhere. I wanted to write it while it was fresh in my mind. And I thought nothing else, it just may go into a drawer somewhere. But I wrote the first 4 chapters. Then I decided I had a young college student. She was a music major in the organ, and she was an excellent subject. I've been doing a lot of experimenting with her with remote viewing and time travel. So I thought, well, that would be a good one to try this on, just to see if it could happen by following his instructions. So I never told her what I was going to do. We always did experiments. So I went to her house and I said, do you want to try an experiment? She said, yeah, it's okay. Just tell me what it's all about when it's over. So I followed his instructions, not knowing what was going to happen. There he was, the same man in the same room. Incidentally, this is done with a mirror. He has a black obsidian mirror that I found he would go into trance and stare at the mirror, and he would go out of his body and see all of these things. And he told us later, then when he come back into his body, he would find he had written the prophecies, the 4 lines by automatic writing. That was how it was done. And I just did a filming for the History Channel a few months ago, and they wanted to know the process and all of this. So I was explaining how all this was done. But anyway, here he was, the same man in the same room with the mirror, and he said, oh, you're here, now we can continue, now we can get down to work. Of course, I was too dumbfounded that first time. I said, well, we did it. I think of doing the prophecies, I just began asking him a lot of questions about his life and everything. But that started out, the whole volume 1 is my work with, Elena was the one that went to Alaska, and then Brenda. And during that time, I got the book. I didn't know what I was reading. I would open the book anywhere it happened to be, and I would read the quatrain, the prophecy, and then I would check it off. And we'd go to another one, not knowing what I was doing. In the first book, we ended up doing about 300 of the prophecies in 6 weeks' time, only seeing her once a week. That's a lot, especially when you're working with something as complicated as this. There was no thinking at all. She would just automatically tell me what they meant. But there were a lot of times he would tell us that's not correct translation. Something's wrong here. It's not been done right. And first he would say, read it in French. That I don't know French. And the girl didn't know French either. I said, that don't matter. You don't speak French the way I do anyway. But he said, if you can keep the vowels and the consonants pure, maybe I would understand it without you butchering it too much. But I didn't want to do it unless I really had to. And he would say, well, read it. I don't know what it is. And but it was so funny. But there were times whenever we were doing it that way, and there were people in the room observing, and we had one man one time who understood French, and he said, he is correcting you in old French, not modern French. There was so much in this whole thing that was just beyond belief. But anyway, through her, we ended up doing 300, and he said, don't worry about the ones that happened in the past. They'll only be interesting to people who are interested in history. Concentrate on now. It was in the 80s and the next 20 years. That there's going to be more things happening in the next 20 years than have happened in the last 100 years. It's going to be a very important, powerful time you're living in. So he said, focus on that. And it was my job here. I'm reading these things. I don't have no idea what time period they belong in or anything. I have thousands and thousands of pages of transcript. You imagine, this was not just this one. It gets more complicated. But I had to transcribe all of that. I had to put it in some kind of order, some kind of chronological order. Now, he said many times, it's very difficult to put a time, a date on anything. You know, any psychic, it's very difficult for any of them to put a date on something. Because how do they know? He said the only way he could tell a date was if he could see a part of the sky and he could make out constellations. Then he might have an idea of some kind of a time frame. Otherwise, everything looked futuristic to him. He has no way of knowing it's all way ahead of his time. So there was no way to really date anything. And he said it doesn't matter because he explained there are nexus points. And a nexus point is an event or a personality that must happen. That is central. But from that nexus point, time branches out in many probabilities and possibilities. So we said the future is never set in stone. It can always be changed. It's malleable. This is why it's very hard to tell the future, especially imagine 400 years ahead of his time, because there's too many things that can happen that can change the event that he saw. But on these probabilities and possibilities, there is every possible outcome from the worst to the least of the event. And this is what he told me. He said, this time frame right now is so important. He said, if I tell you the most horrible things man can do to himself, will you do something to correct it? That's what he wanted us to know. People say he's doom and gloom. He said, I'm telling you the worst possible scenarios, the worst possible result of what I see. It doesn't mean that's the only result, but he wanted us to know that to shake us up. He said, I've got to get your attention. He said, otherwise you're not going to listen to me. So he told us the most horrible things that he saw. Well, anyway, this went on for about 6 months. I was working with Brenda. And she'd come to a point where she couldn't work with me anymore. that she was in college and she had to drop out.